In the deep dark, the Aslan are moving, but there is a darker power. There is something behind the claw.
Hi, I'm Felbrig, and welcome to the first episode of Behind the Claw. So what is this fresh new podcast you've stuck in your ear? The intent is that this podcast is entirely about Classic Traveller. That is, the role-playing game that came out in the 70s, simply called Traveller, and that's now referred to as Classic, because there's been, I think, 4 or 5 versions of Traveller since then. Before I started on this little venture, I did some Googling, but couldn't find any evidence of a Classic Traveller podcast. If I'm wrong in that, please get in touch, let me know what I've been missing out on. So, who am I to be talking about Traveller? Well, first of all, I'm not an expert. I'm a player, I'm a referee, but I tend to play fast and loose with the rules anyway, so I'm no expert on the rules. I have got a segment coming up in this podcast where I focus on a rule that, frankly, I've never used before. So, we'll both be learning. My personal history with Traveller is that I started playing it 5 or 6 sessions back in the 80s. I even went as far as writing a few early computer programs to generate sectors and characters for myself, but didn't go beyond more, as I said, than 5 or 6 sessions. Of late, my obsession with the game has come to the fore. This resurgence, this refreshed interest in Traveller came around when a chap I was working with handed me a copy of the rules that had been signed by the guy who wrote them, Mark Miller. I ended up staying up late a couple of nights as I reread the rules, and it really brought it back to the fore. And around this time, Google Plus was taking off with the wonderful Hangout system, and so I got involved in an online game, and in fact, I'm now about a year into running a campaign set in the Classic Traveller universe. This means I've got the experience, if not the expertise. If you have any interest in following the campaign that I'm running, you can look for the session reports on my own website at felbrig.blogspot.co.uk, and I also copy-paste them onto the RPG Geek site. The next question I suppose you'll have is, who is this podcast for? Well, I'm a referee at the moment, so it's basically for other referees, or people who are looking for ideas to incorporate into their own game, so I guess anybody who's got an interest in the Classic Traveller game. I've thrown this show together, basically. There's going to be a few different segments, but they're not set in stone. If you have any ideas or anything you'd like included, then please get in touch. You can email me at behindtheclaw@outlook.com. And with that little introduction out of the way, let's get started. I have no idea, so computer, what can you tell me about this place? In this segment, that I'm calling for now at least My Galaxy, I'm going to introduce you to the people, the planets, the systems of the subsector known as Tsesso. This subsector was initially generated by one of the online systems that's available, and I've been fleshing it out ever since as I've been using it as the home for my current ongoing campaign. There is a gap in space between human Imperium space and that held by the Aslan. The Tsesso subsector is along that frontier. All through this subsector, there are words and whispers of an oncoming war with the Aslan. As you can imagine, being on the frontier, this causes a lot of anxiety amongst the population. There are 26 planetary systems within the subsector. 2 have been marked by the Imperium as red zones and are prohibited to normal traffic. 4 are marked as amber for various reasons which we'll go into later. The capital of this subsystem is a planet called Tsesso. It is in fact a gas giant and not populated. Orbiting this planet are 143 moons and many man-made satellites. All of these are occupied. Therefore the capital doesn't inhabit the planet itself, but all the moons and satellites that orbit it. When the Imperium first moved into this subsector, there was no plan to have the capital at Tsesso, but it simply grew into it because it was able to have such high-quality starports. Or rather, the whole place, because it was in space, was a starport. There's no one place to land your starships here. Every facility that you might want from a normal starport is available on any number of the moons. And, unusually, most starports have a dirt side option, but there is no dirt side here because all these moons are orbiting a gas giant. Apart from the orbiting of Tsesso itself, the only other livable portion in this system is a small planet called Stallone. Stallone is wholly owned by a megacorp called Indes. They use the planet for farming purposes. A number of stakeholders live across the planet, all employees of Indes, and they farm for the moss, which is edible, which grows in the cracks and crannies of that planet. The majority of the population of Tsesso live on just a few of the moons. The rest of the moons are occupied and do have people living there, but generally speaking, these are used for starport purposes or industrial purposes. If you need a habitable dome for anything, perhaps to set up your own business, it can be relatively cheap to hire or buy a dome on one of the outer moons. In counterbalance to that, however, you have to be super rich in order to get an apartment on the major population centres. The government of Tsesso is multi-layered. It has a Senate and it has a Secretary General who runs the place. The Senate itself is relatively powerless, because the Secretary General makes most of the decisions and implements most of the policies at his own whim. Most of the population realise that the Senate itself is quite weak, but this doesn't prevent the Senate from taking a lot of airs and graces. Trying to manoeuvre your way past a senator would be quite difficult because his ego is so large. Due to this relative self-importance, it can be very difficult to get anything done, because this has led to a lot of red tape and self-aggrandizement by the various officials. For instance, if you wanted to speak to the Secretary General, you'd have to go through many people to get there. You'd have to speak to a secretary in an office somewhere, who'd refer you to the Argonivore who makes appointments. He'd probably refer you to the tailor band who carries appointments from one office to the other, and then you might be able to speak to the assistant admissions advisor, who himself would talk on your behalf to the admissions advisor. He would then refer you to the chief of the Guardsman's Directorate, who would then take you on to the proxy assistants. At that point, you might actually get to speak to the Secretary General. Very recently, the Secretary General changed by a somewhat unexpected route. There had been rumours for quite some time that Taylor Alabenga, who was the Secretary General, had gone a bit loopy. Well, recently, the man who was his closest assistant, Daveland Wathoon, seems to have ascended to the position of Secretary General. It seems Taylor Alabenga simply signed over his position to his subordinate and has left and nobody's seen him since. There is some suspicion that something underhand took place, but there was no problem, there's been no bloodletting, there's been no major coup, so everybody's willing to let it slide. Okay, that's all I've got on Tsesso for the moment. As I've mentioned, there's 26 other planets that we'll take a brief visit to in future episodes.
No way. The way I heard it is that he was shipping arms, guns, taking them straight in, under the Navi's nose.
In this segment, I'm going to present to you a story seed. It's my hope that this will be useful for you. It might allow you to, like I did, use it to open a brand new campaign, or alternatively, you could use it as the basis for a one-shot at a convention or some such. The premise of this opening is that the PCs wake up out of cold birth. They're on a deck filled with 200 or 300 other cold births. All but maybe 1 or 2 of these berths are already open. Those that are still closed contain people who've passed away during the normal process of going through low birth. But all the other open pods are empty. The PCs themselves are naked. They've also lost their memory, again, part of the process of low birth. If you're in a low birth for too long, then your memory tends to fade. And that's what's happened here. The PCs originally signed up to join a new colony expedition. The ship was due to make 2 or 3 jumps to a rather remote location and then set up a new colony. But obviously something's gone wrong. They've woken up and a lot of time has passed. In fact, if they're able to investigate, they'll find that their pods have only opened after the maximum length of time that anyone can safely stay ensconced within one. It's an automatic safety system. All the other colonists, except those who I've already mentioned as being dead, have disappeared. Keep in mind that the PCs don't remember what they've done. They don't know why they're naked, they don't know why they're getting out of a low berth, and they don't know where they are. So the first part of the game will be spent with them trying to investigate their situation and find out what's happened. All the crew of the starship have also disappeared. In fact, the only survivor they'll find on the ship is living in the shuttle down in the cargo bay. He's been living off the stores that the colonists were supposed to be using when they set up their base camp. He's been living down there for a number of years. And the story that he tells is going to be somewhat incoherent because he's gone a bit loopy through living on his own. If any of the PCs look out of a porthole, they'll be able to spot that they are in fact in orbit over the planet they were supposed to colonize. They'll also spot an alien spacecraft. It's a huge spacecraft, even bigger than their colony ship. It's connected to the colony ship via an umbilical, something you can actually walk through if you can find the airlock it's connected to. In my campaign, it was an Aslan ship, so I'll refer to it as the Aslan ship here, but you could use any alien race you want. When the colony ship turned up here, the crew that was still awake found this alien ship apparently abandoned. So they decided to connect up to it and go and investigate. What actually happened was, this is also a colony ship from the Aslan. They were coming to this very self-same planet to colonize it as well. They brought with them some nano-machines, which they were going to use for building operations. But something went wrong. The nano-machines escaped and started killing the Aslan crew. They didn't manage to kill all of the crew, but most of them. The remaining Aslan crew went down to the planet and have set up a camp down there. Then along comes this new colony expedition. They find the ship many years later. They connect up to it and they go on board. But as they do that, it's at the very end of the lifespan of the nano-machines, and unfortunately, they come back with them when they come back on board the colony ship and start attacking the crew and the colonists. When they realised what was happening, somebody in the crew decided to try and get the rest of the colonists off the ship as quickly as possible. By opening most of the cold storage pods, they unfortunately just sentenced these people to death. As the PCs wander around this large empty ship, they'll discover that there were some attempts made to try and seal off different areas. Sadly, however, this didn't work. In fact, the only survivor is that man who's living down in the cargo bay. He managed to survive simply because he happened to be wearing a vac suit at the time that these nano-robots came on board. He stayed scared in his vac suit and in the shuttle, keeping himself sealed off from the outside air for as long as his vac suit could run. Luckily for him, perhaps luckily for him, he survived because the nano-robots ran out of power, ran out of juice, just before he ran out of air. And that's it. So to summarise, your people will wake up, they won't know where they are. You can perhaps use checks against the character's intelligence to try and remember facts as you go along, or even to remember their skills as they go along. They'll have all the resources of this giant colony ship and everything it was carrying to set up the colony. They'll also be able to have access, if they want to risk it, to that Aslan colony ship. And in fact, they can make contact with the Aslan survivors down on the planet.
No, sir, you may not dock here.
What the hell? I just made 3 jumps to get here.
Without permit 7C, you may not dock. Now move out to the holding line at 6,000 kilometres.
There's a rule within Traveller that I've never used. I've simply overlooked it or chosen to ignore it. And that is the role of surprise within combat. I personally rediscovered the existence of the surprise rules when I was looking up a particular situation in the combat section. I don't know what it was, I just simply missed it, or ignored it, I don't know. When you read it, it comes across very much as though it was inspired entirely by D&D. the idea of getting a free attack in, although there is a little bit more to it within the Traveller system. You do roll dice, both sides in this case roll dice, so the NPCs and the PCs will each roll a die, and there are various modifiers to it. But if the PCs actually win the surprise by, I think it's 3 or more, they actually have the option of avoiding the encounter altogether. They can choose to just not have that encounter, and this is very important, and yet I've never used it. Considering that I'm actually running a game that's a mercenary company doing various combat missions, I've never actually used this surprise. It's just not something I've tried to use as a general rule. I like to set up my encounters beforehand and play the story through, as it were, rather than letting the dice decide whether there will or won't be an encounter. I'm still struggling, really, to work out whether I would use this. I think perhaps I should, at least to give the PCs the option of coming across an encounter. But if I set up an enemy for them that creates an ambush, then it does seem a bit odd to give the game away by asking them to roll for surprise. As soon as I do that, I've told them that there's an enemy there. Of course, I suppose if they win it, they get to establish the range at which the encounter is going to take place, or indeed if there will be an encounter. But if I win, then I'm just going to attack them anyway. So I'm not sure, from a story perspective, wouldn't it be better to just open fire on them and not have a die roll? So as you can see, I'm a little conflicted about whether I would or wouldn't want to use this rule. However, there are some DMs to that die roll, and they actually bring in some of the skills that would otherwise be left behind. For instance, leader skill gives you a +1 on this die, which means your leadership skill actually has a real genuine use. If you have tactical skill, that likewise gives you a +1 on that die roll. And these are skills that are generally pretty wishy-washy and hard to use within your game. But here, they have a very solid use. They give you that advantage. They allow you to choose to help you to choose the range at which an encounter will take place, or indeed if there will be an encounter. And that means those two skills actually come to the fore. And those are skills that I have otherwise been ignoring to a large extent. Anyway, once you've established your surprise, you then determine the encounter range. That's the range at which you've spotted the enemy. And there are a number of dice modifiers for that as well. You roll 2 dice and then you modify for the terrain you're in. So if you're in forests, for instance, you'd add 1 to the dice, which gives it a slightly better chance of being a longer range encounter. But if you're in the clear or open terrain, then you would add 3 to the dice, which obviously means you can have your encounter at a longer range. Of course, if you win surprise and the enemy don't spot you, then that allows you to choose the range at which you're going to open fire or attack them from. The more I think about this, the mercenary campaign that I'm running at the moment, I should have been using this rule. I will use this rule. I think I threw it away because I didn't like the narrative control it gave me as a referee. But I think it actually empowers the PCs. It brings some of their skills to the fore. It allows them to deal with ambushes before they get there, and that doesn't make the story any less powerful, just because they launch a counter-ambush as opposed to falling into an ambush that I'd planned. No, I think this is a worthwhile rule, and I'm going to try and implement it.
Ah, damn piece of junk! Who bought this anyway? No, don't you dare say it was me.
In this section, I'm going to take a look at a PDF product and basically tell you what's in it and tell you what I think of it. Consider it a review. So today's product is called the ISCV King Richard. It appears to have been produced by FASA way back in 1981, or at least the printed version of it. And it's approved for use with Traveller, or so it says on the front cover of the PDF. You can get this PDF from DriveThruRPG or any of its associates. This is what it says as far as a back cover blurb goes. The ISCV King Richard, a luxury liner of the first class carrying diplomats, rich citizens, and most important people in the Imperium. The King Richard, a luxury liner of the first class, is bound to be the centre and/or target of murder, assassination plots, theft, hijack, terrorism, kidnapping and more. And that's what you get here. A lot of details about this ship called the King Richard, and most importantly, the deck plans for it. On the printed book, there were 23 11 by 17 deck plans, which were available as 2-page spreads. When you download the product, there are a lot of files involved. The first and primary one, of course, is the PDF itself, and this is a 57-page PDF. It opens with a few pages of text telling you about the King Richard itself. It gives you an overview of the various shops, the various decks, and the engineering sections that appear within the ship. There are also details of the crew and how security is arranged. And once all of that preliminary stuff is out of the way, it moves on to the deck plans. The first set of graphics you get show you a representation of the ship, or at least of the various decks that go to make it up. Then come a couple of images showing you the various air ducts and maintenance access ways. After that, you get into the actual deck plans themselves. All of the plans are fairly detailed. Each of the staterooms available to the passengers is displayed here, and you can see each individual chair, table and bed within that stateroom. The same goes for the toilet block. You can see the individual sinks and toilets. There's a lot of detail on these maps. All the deck plans are in simple black and white line drawings, very clear to read within the PDF, but it does suffer somewhat in that each page of the PDF only shows a part of a deck plan. For instance, the length of the ship might easily run across 4 or 5 pages of this PDF. One feature that I particularly like is the fact that the ship's 2 shuttles are detailed, and you can see how the seating is arranged within those shuttles. I mentioned that there are a number of files within this product when you download it. The first is the PDF I've been describing. The rest of the files are made up from images of the deck plans. There has been appears to have been, some additional work, rather than just being a scan of what was in the original book. They seem to have taken the double-page spreads from the book and combined them into single images. However, as I said, the ship is very long, and at the scale used, you don't get an entire deck appearing in one image. This is a little unfortunate. When I was using these deck plans within Roll20, I wanted the whole deck to be displayed at one time, and therefore I had to combine these images myself into single deck plans. But that's about the only downside I found with this product. It doesn't purport to be anything more than deck plans, and that is what it is. So it met my expectations amply. I think it only cost a £2-3 sterling to purchase it, so $6, maybe $7, I suppose. It was definitely worth the money to me. It makes playing out a scenario or playing a game based around this ship exceedingly easy. It gives you a lot of interesting locations to work with. And I especially enjoyed the fact that every stateroom is not the same. They're laid out differently, enabling you as a referee to describe each room differently just by a quick look at the plan. Would I recommend this? Yes, if you're a referee or plan to have a game of snapshot, perhaps, this would be a great environment to play in. But, depending on what you want to do with it, you may have to stitch some images together.
Did you hear that? What the hell do you think it is? Is it dangerous?
In this segment, I'm going to introduce you to a new animal, an alien animal that could exist on any planet you care to drop it on. In this case, I'm lifting it from my current campaign. On the planet of Oratruz, there is a little-known creature simply called the Nightmare. It does have an official Imperial catalogue number, but that's rather uninteresting, but just for reference, 0567 EGH-797-A. It's called the Nightmare because of the amount of terrible damage it can inflict on anybody who comes into contact with it in its older and fully formed state. The creature actually hatches from a soft egg underwater. It emerges from that egg as a small eel-like creature. As it quickly grows, and by quickly I mean a couple of months at the most, it grows first of all into a tadpole-like creature. It keeps its basic eel shape, but develops a frog-like face and grows arms at the forward end. As it moves into the next stage, it actually grows rudimentary legs, and at this point it's able to emerge from the water and start moving about on land. During this early land stage, it's able to actually eat any plant matter as well as any creatures smaller than itself. As it continues to grow, it loses the eel-like tail, which ends up as a small stump at the back. The legs remain short but become very strong. The arms give it a sort of gorilla-like appearance as they are longer than the legs, and it often goes around on all four. Although it converts from being a water breather to being an air breather, it still spends the majority of its time in the water. The creatures are believed to be fully grown once they reach 3 meters tall. They are very strong and very fast. They're also able to occasionally put on a burst of speed or a feat of strength that would far outweigh what you would think it was capable of. When it moves fast, it's actually faster than the human can follow, and they appear as a blur. This only lasts a few seconds. But in that time, this creature could have burst into a camp, smashed through walls, grabbed hold of a couple of poor individuals, and dragged them back under the water. In this later, fully developed stage, the creature is generally speaking meat-eating only, having forsaken the easier-to-catch plant food that it was eating in its lower stages. It's worth pointing out that the creature is at all stages cannibalistic. Generally speaking, though, it would eat only smaller members of its own race. This behaviour changes, however, once they become fully grown. At that stage they become very territorial, and they will attack and drive off any of their own kind. Indeed, when other game cannot be found, they tend to subsist entirely on their own younger brethren. A strange behaviour has been noted with the immature versions of the creatures. At irregular intervals, the immature creatures emerge from the water as a horde. The creatures appear to be in a frenzy at this point. They will rapidly attack each other and any other creatures that they can find within reach. The mad killing frenzy continues for a number of hours until the creatures that survive, return back to the water. The inspiration for this creature is taken from a book called The Legacy of Heorot. That's spelled Heorot. The book is a science fiction story where colonists are setting up on a new planet. The Grendel myth has been bound up and used within this story, and I'd recommend the book if you can find it.
Welcome, traveller, to the Galactic Audio Library.
Sometimes in my games I like to produce little audio drama segments or snippets of audio to play to the players, and that's what I'm going to present in this segment. The background for my campaign is set on the edge of the Imperium, but there's currently a war going on with the Aslan across this area. The lower half of the subsector that the PCs are currently in has been invaded, and I've been dropping little written snippets of information or news articles to the players with each session. But to switch things up a bit, I had this piece of audio commissioned.
Yeah, we came in like a battleship, blowing the little cat faces away. They died real easy. I must have killed 20 with my ACR. But then, they came in with the robots. You shoot them, they don't bleed. They got in our lines, started tearing the guys up. It was hand and claw. We were fighting all the way back to the landing ground. We got out. I'll fight them again! For my brothers! For the Imperium!
If you're interested in doing anything similar to this yourself, I can recommend you go to Fiverr.com. That's where I found the voice actor that did this work for me, and he did it for only $5.
Thanks for the trade, Tuchel. It was a pleasure doing business with you. So long, sucker.
Well, that's about it. This is the end of this first podcast. Hopefully it'll be the first of a whole series of them, but As you can tell, it's been a bit of an experiment. If you have any ideas or suggestions for the podcast, then please get in touch. You can email me at behindtheclaw@outlook.com. Indeed, there's also a website for this podcast called behindtheclaw.blogspot.co.uk. I've put up a sector map for Tercesso subsector there, the one I've referred to in this podcast, and I'll also put a link there to the Arnold Schwarzenegger impersonation you just heard. So that's it. Goodbye. Thanks for listening. This podcast is released on an attribution non-commercial no derivatives license. Its home on the web is at behindtheclaw.blogspot.co.uk. Music by Kevin MacLeod of incompetech.com. I'm your host, Felbrig Napoleon Herriot. Thanks for listening. Prepare for jump.